What is going on YouTube? This is Acid Roots. So I'm going to review the third album by rock singer Ozzy Osbourne. Basically, this project is called Bark at the Moon, and it came out in the fall of 1983. Now I reviewed a couple Ozzy Osbourne albums. I reviewed Blizzard of Oz last year, and I also reviewed Diary of a Madman last year. But those particular albums were different just because they had the hit guitarist on there, Randy Rhoads, who passed away in early 1982, and he was getting ready to leave the Ozzy Osbourne Collective and like start a new band or something like that. But the particular pitch about it was just with this particular one is just the fact that there are some folks out there that kind of feel like Ozzy's best days were like in the early 80s and then the stuff with Black Sabbath in the 70s as far as that pitch kind of has with it. But this is an interesting album. I've never really listened to this album like that. I'd have to suppose I want to see what it was about and just the pitch behind it. I would have to say it's a solid enough album, but it's not a classic. I would have to say I really thoroughly enjoyed Diary of a Madman that had some excellent riffage on there and stuff like that. And Blizzard of Oz was also a pretty highlighted one within a certain pitch as well, I'd have to say. But this particular album, I feel like it's just kind of middle of the road, just kind of solid enough. It doesn't. This particular album is just kind of middle of the road, but unless you get the deluxe edition that has the song Spiders on there, it's not really too much to speak of, really. I'd have to say I really wound up recommending 4 songs out of the 8 on here, plus out of the 2 songs that are bonus on here, I only wound up recommending one of those. So it's basically 5 out of 10 songs on this particular album. The 2002 edition of this album has 10 songs. That's the Spotify edition that I'm reviewing. So I'd have to say I wound up recommending to you 5 songs out of those 10. A little bit more of like a far cry from Ozzy Osbourne's earlier hits, I would have to suppose. I know some of his Black Sabbath stuff was pretty good as well. I may eventually get to that at some point, but I would have to say I'm definitely gonna cover more Ozzy in the 80s and 90s as far as that pitch can happen. But I was a little bit somewhat disappointed with this particular project just because I thought it was going to be a little bit more of like some kind of more kinetic type fare. I mean, it has some good enough gems on here, but I just kind of feel like the overall riffage, they just don't highlight it enough within the prospect of trying to get that full blown as far as that kind of goes. Like, I feel like the songs with Randy Rhoads just really eviscerated things because he was always trying to show off some particular type pitches and just have like some of these ones, but there's really not. Like the best song on this particular album is just Bark at the Moon, the title track. I feel like that's the overall best song, and I think Spotify agrees with that being the only song that has over 100 million plays or anything close to 100 million plays. But I'd have to say it's just kind of the concept that I just didn't really see enough of riffage of just like standard bops on here. There's a lot of songs that have over 5 minutes on here, so there's not really like single type. There's really not too much like single type formats of songs that would be like 3.5 or 4.5 minutes that are just meant for radio and stuff like that. It's interesting that Ozzy was gone for like a couple years, but then he only came back with like 2 singles, one of which was like a ballad type song. So the other one was like So Tired, which I just would have to say the other single was So Tired, which was, yeah, just a ballad that was really a far cry from some real kind of compelling type ones. I mean, Ozzy can. I feel like Ozzy nailed the ballads better on like Diary of a Madman, but this particular it just happened to. So I kind of feel like they definitely need another song. I like the pitch behind Diary of a Madman when there were 2 kind of up tempo kind of type songs that kind of had like some good riffage on there, like Flying High Again, and then Over the Mountain were 2 riff heavy. Flying High Again and then Over the Mountain were 2 riff heavy type ones that just had a lot of good up tempo type feels about them, and just overall were very these were just some ones that were very compelling and just did a lot of good visceral type stuff just overall within that particular pitch about it. But I just feel like the I feel like the promotion off this particular album was just far too brief, and then it just kind of switched the tempo way too quickly for that particular pitch. It just kind of felt like it was a through the motions type project, which is interesting because Ozzy has a song on this particular album called Slow Down, but this project kind of felt like it was through the motions as well. It just kind of came and went as far as that pitch kind of happened. Definitely, like I was saying, needed another song like Bark at the Moon, something like that, but there's really not even another song like Bark at the Moon on this particular album. There are some hangout type songs on here. The Wikipedia says that this album kind of had like some pop metal type sound, which I don't really see that much. I don't really see this as much being like a pop metal type record as much as it is just kind of like more hard rock and like a more bar hopping type sense, just with like a little bit of like decent kind of commercial type fare, but still not enough to really get to the point of breaking even like with songs like Crazy Train and some of those type ones and Flying High Again, I would have to suppose. This kind of the concept that still this album was still relatively trite and trying to break forward and get towards some new audiences as far as that pitch. I mean, it succeeded in getting like some songs on the radio and stuff like that and having some good riffage and metal and stuff like that. It's just kind of the concept that just didn't do it like to the severe degree that like Diary of a Madman did. That one was definitely a very visceral type record. And then I also feel like songs like Mr. Crowley and Crazy Train are also lacking on this particular album as well as this kind of concept. It just doesn't, I mean, it feels like Ozzy, but just not quite as compelling this time around. I mean, it's kind of a ghastly project. It maintains some of that spook appeal, but in terms of like classic hits that are just bona fide hits that he had like in the early 80s, I would have to suppose it just doesn't have that to that full degree. It just is kind of like it's just kind of like a light packaging of just that particular concept, I'd have to say. But we'll go ahead and talk about the singles on here. So the first single is Bark at the Moon, the title track, like I was saying. This is like a sharp kind of a visceral. Bark at the Moon is like a sharp kind of a visceral in motion gem, I would have to say. This has some great riffage and haunting ghastliness about this particular song, I would have to say, and this is just classic Ozzy. So I definitely appreciate this one. Definitely appreciate the melodies on here, just the overall ghastliness, and just overall, this is a stock Ozzy song. This is definitely one of his best hits, in my opinion, from what I've heard from him thus far, I would have to say. This is up there with Crazy Train, Over the Mountain, Flying High Again, some of those type ones, I would have to say. Just an overall excellent riffage. You would think that Randy Rhoads was still alive on this particular song. It's not to say anything against the current guitarist. I would have to say, like, Jake Ely is pretty good off this particular project. Jake Ely is pretty good off this particular project. We just don't get a ton of songs to really showcase that, like Bark at the Moon kind of does. I would have to say that's the best song on this particular album. It stands to the point that that's just kind of the concept about it. But So Tired is the second single, and I don't recommend this song. But I would have to say it's decent enough, I would have to say, but then I just really didn't have much of a taste for it, I'd have to suppose. This is just kind of like a ballad type song, but it just doesn't maintain like the ghastliness that Ozzy's kind of known for. I would kind of feel like this one was just a poor type one that just didn't really deliver on that particular front. It just happened way too soon. This should have been like the third single. This should have been like the third type single. I don't know why Ozzy didn't put 3 singles on this particular album, and I also don't know why he didn't have like another song like Bark at the Moon or something like that. Another song like Flying High Again. Just a good riff heavy type one. I probably would have chose Spiders. I would have chose something like that. That would have been a nice one, even though that's not quite as full blown as much like a single. I probably would have chosen like Now You See It, Now You Don't. That might have been a nice one. That one's kind of a chugging along type one, kind of a hangout type tune. But it's just kind of the concept. But this was odd that Ozzy was so shy on hits on this particular album. It just kind of felt like a weird transitional type stage for him, is because normally he was like one of the flagship metal artists like the early 80s. So it just didn't make a ton of sense that he didn't have more stock hits kind of on here. Because I do feel like Bark at the Moon is overall, that's a career highlight for Ozzy. That's definitely one of his best songs. That's definitely one of his best songs. So it's just kind of the concept that there's just no other song like it on this whole album, which is kind of a vast disappointment, I would have to say. But it's just kind of concept. So it's not So Tired. Don't recommend that one. But to basically talk about the songs I do recommend on here. So there's 10 songs basically on the Spotify edition. There's 2 extra songs on here, which would be Spiders and then one up the B side. Which out of those particular 10 songs, like I was saying, I recommend 5. So the 5 songs I recommend would be Bark at the Moon, You're No Different, Spiders, Now You See It, Now You Don't, and then Rock and Roll Rebel, I would have to say. So it's just kind of the concept about it. So basically, to talk about some of these, Spiders is a real nice highlight. I would definitely recommend getting the deluxe edition from 2002. It's a pretty good pitch to kind of get that one, even if I don't recommend both those songs on there. I do feel like Spiders is a real nice song. This is a ghastly type. This is definitely a ghastly type song from Ozzy, and I appreciate this one. This is another almost damn near career highlight, I'd have to say, at least in terms of like the early 80s, I would have to suppose. This is a creeping kind of night crawler with some grim band work, I would have to say. It's kind of a murky out and about type tune, I would have to say, and it's just kind of a sluggish. The song's just kind of a sluggish, kind of city stepping type bop, I would have to say. So I really like this one. Just really some murky typeness that it kind of has particularly about it. Just really appreciate the kind of grim type feel and this overall kind of just creepy crawly type stuff that kind of goes along with this particular song. Ozzy really has some good melodies on this particular song and just nails it pretty well, I'd have to say. Clever type song. This definitely need to be on the standard edition. I probably would have removed one of the more stretching type songs like Forever or like Waiting for Darkness, one of those type ones, and throwing Spiders on there, because I feel like there are some kind of stretching type songs. Like I was saying, there's a lot of songs with over 5 minutes that are kind of just more of like stretchers and without like some interesting kind of riff work and stuff like that. It's just not quite as compelling, I'd have to suppose. But I do feel like Spiders is a pretty nice one that just has the great band work on there that does it. Rock and Roll Rebel is a pretty good highlight. This one reminds me of Flying High Again off the Diary of a Madman. I'd have to say this is a Flying High Again type gem. I would have to say this is an Out in the Wind and kind of dap song. I would definitely feel like, and by dap I just mean initial kind of congregating, fraternizing, that type of stuff. Just some of that type of stuff as far as that pitch kind of happens. And this is just a regular kind of hangout day fare of a song. And I would probably almost say late day fare, just something for like 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock p.m., something like that. There's not really as many full blown nightclub type songs, I would have to suppose, just within that relative pitch. I would have to say just the concept of being able to say and stuff as far as that kind of goes along with it. Something for like 10 o'clock p.m. or midnight, something like that. I would have to suppose. So this is still a pretty nice one just to kind of get. Definitely some Traverse type tunes. Rock and Roll Rebel would have to be just a good In the Wind type song. I would definitely have to feel like, but I'd probably say if you're looking for like a hangout type song, something similar to like Alice in Chains and some of those type folks, some Iron Maiden type stuff. I'd say Now You See It, Now You Don't. It's a pretty good one for that particular concept. This is definitely like a pub. This is definitely like a pub like hangout bruiser of a song. I'd have to say definitely a pretty good concept for that. It's like a typical. This would be some typical kind of outing jazz. I would have to say, and this is just a stock Ozzy cut for On the Town. I would have to definitely suppose, and this is just kind of a vanilla bop. I would have to say. So I definitely appreciate this one. This is just some standard kind of hangout fare. I would have to say definitely appreciate the concept of getting this one in particular. It's just some good stuff, but this is just such a mildly packaged kind of album that you just have to appreciate these songs, but then you have to realize that there's not a ton of songs like it, which I do think there probably could have been another song like Now You See It, Now You Don't. It's just kind of through the motions as far as that pitch kind of happens. There are some good songs on here, but it's just not to the complete kind of affability of like getting multiple kind of ones. I mean, I realized that back in the early 80s and the 70s and stuff that most albums were only like 8 or 9 songs as far as that pitch kind of goes, but you just don't get like enough of like a taste of some of these highlights because I feel like, you know, the side one to this particular album with Bark at the Moon, Now You See It, Now You Don't, Rock and Roll Rebel, and You're No Different, that's the best side of it. I feel like side two really kind of lags a bit, which is unfortunate. I mean, normally when you had like side one kick ass and side two not kick ass, that kind of made it less of like a classic. But I would at least say the first 4 songs you hear on like a classic record type song or something like that, I'd have to say the first 4 songs are at least damn near classic. It's just kind of a middle of the road type project in terms of like record type fare. But I'd have to say it's just kind of haphazard. I would look after it. It's just the kind of concept about it. It's just some lagging songs. We'll get to that in a moment, but You're No Difference, another highlighted one. I do appreciate this song. This is one where I can see it kind of being pop metal, like Wikipedia was trying to describe. I feel like this is kind of like a ghoulish kind of pop metal. I would have to say this song reeks of like 80s haze and cheesiness. I would have to suppose just within that pitch. Not to say the 80s were cheesy, but just kind of some of that hair type cheesiness that kind of goes along, some of that kind of hazy type cheesiness that goes along with it. But it's pretty awesome. I do appreciate that concept of the 80s and such. This just works as like a ghastly kind of commercial rock stretcher. I would have to say it's a pretty good concept for that one. This is probably one of the more commercial ones. I'm surprised that this wasn't a single or something like that because I would have liked more songs like this on this particular album. Once again, it's like Spiders, Bark at the Moon, Now You See It, some of those type ones, and even Rock and Roll Rebel. All of these needed to be replicated in some format. But I kind of feel like with this being such a short album, it's just kind of the concept that every song kind of had. Like it, every song kind of had its purpose. So this is kind of the concept about it, but it just didn't really deliver as full blown. Some of these were kind of more misses just within the concept. But to talk about some of these songs that I don't recommend on here, like talk about some of these songs I didn't recommend on here, like So Tired. I already talked about not recommending that one. That one was just kind of a poor ballad, I'd have to say. Slow Down, I really didn't like the lyric composition of that one. The riffage was not as interesting on that particular one either. It was trying to be like a good like kind of chugging along type one just for vehicle boundness and stuff like that, just kind of being out and about, but I just didn't really agree with the composition behind it, just slowing down and kind of slow and steady type atmosphere. Just didn't appreciate so much. I mean, it would have been better if it would have had better riffage and just overall band work on that particular one, but it's just not as much of a compelling one. Center of Eternity. Center of Eternity was one that kind of took a while to start up, and it just didn't have that much interesting kind of instrumentation on that one either. That was kind of another chugging along type one for out and about, but it just didn't really deliver as well. I kind of feel like the guitar work on here, like I do feel like Jake E. Lee is good enough. I just feel like the songs, he definitely should have proved himself a lot better with songs like Bark at the Moon and some of those type ones. He just didn't have enough shining type moments to really get forth and really do some of these. They just didn't give him enough kind of like single type formats and nightclub type songs and stuff like that to really have like some good dance bounce and things like that to really show off just the aspect of having him do something more recreational. Just didn't really fit that well, I'd have to say. And then and then I just didn't really appreciate the feel of Waiting for Darkness. That one was kind of a Waiting for Darkness was kind of a disappointment because I would have felt like that a song title like that would have been a lot better, but I just didn't like the arrangements of how that one. But I just didn't like the arrangements of how that one in particular kind of went as far as that pitch kind of went along with it. It was just, I mean, I feel like that one was just kind of more of like a stretching type one, but it just didn't really nail it quite as well. I mean, there just were some ones on here. I don't know why they went with so many 5-minute songs on here. They just should have definitely had more kind of snappier type ones or just something like that. That this would have been more attention grabbing and things of that nature, especially with the new guitarists and some new folks on the staff as far as that particular pitch kind of happened. But they just didn't really do that within that particular pitch. This is kind of concept. But then I also didn't one up the beast. I was trying to be like a more kind of in your face type one like Spiders and Bark. It's trying to be a more in your face type one like Bark at the Moon, but it just didn't really deliver that well. It's just kind of the concept that some of this band work was just not quite as proficient. I feel like the band work, the guitar work, writing, or some of the riffage on like the earlier albums was just better. Some of these just didn't really deliver in terms of having like that compelling typeness about it. That one up the beast, that was just kind of a poor one. I mean, I would still get the deluxe edition for at least Spiders, but I kind of feel like this one was just kind of a dud just to be able to suppose that. So basically, Me recommending 5 songs out of 10 on this particular album, I'm gonna go ahead and give this album like a 5.5 out of 10. I just kind of feel like it's just a little bit over middle of the road. I feel like this album's just a little bit over middle of the road, I would have to suppose, which is kind of a disappointment just because the earlier 80s albums by Ozzy Osbourne just flatten this, just completely flatten this particular album. I would have to say just stampeded all over it, I'd have to say. The Soja score, I'm going to go ahead and give like a 4.5 out of 10 because I just feel like this is just a real poor representation of getting some of this ghastliness. I feel like the two best moments on this particular album, definitely recommend the 2002 edition for Spiders because without Spiders, this is just even poorer than that. But I would say Bark at the Moon and Spiders are like two of the best moments that have the most snap about them. This overall ghastliness that's typical of Ozzy, I would have to say. But then I would also have to suppose there are some other ones on there like Rock and Roll Rebel and You're No Different, some of those type ones, and Now You See It, Now You Don't. But it's just kind of the concept that it's just, the affability and overall immediate factor of these is just not as full blown, I'd have to say. I just feel like the earlier Ozzy albums just have a little bit more sharper and interface to just be able to say that. So it's just kind of the concept, but definitely get the one with Spiders on there. I would have to say a good concept. There are some ones, Ozzy is kind of ghastly on here, and he does have some good melodies. I would say the melodies on here are pretty good. It's kind of a hooky type project. I'd have to say there are some good hooks when you get them properly. Just kind of the fact that the riffage and the overall instrumentation is just not quite as full blown seasoned up to par, just in terms of like the immediacy of just like some snap and dance craze and just stuff like that outing type fare. Just kind of happens to be a thing. But in terms of the future, like Ozzy dropped a couple albums in the early 2020s, something like that. I know he at least dropped an album in 2020 and possibly 2021, some of those type pitches. So I know that's at least some recent type stuff. I'd have to say I am going to review more 80s Ozzy, probably some 90s Ozzy, some stuff like that. We'll definitely get to some more of these, but this is kind of middle of the road. I do feel like there's at least a couple songs off this album that are must-haves, and just you should be picking this album up for those particular ones. But it just kind of is a little bit lackluster, I'd have to say, for the most part.